We are now live on YouTube with the January 17th, 2019 meeting of the Node.js release working group, being chaired, I believe, by Beth today. Is that correct, Beth?
Yep, correct. Hello. So today we got the agenda issue. It's 407 on the release GitHub, and we've got 4 items on the agenda today. And the first is the additional Semver miner for 8.x string maintenance. I think Miles raised this issue.
Yeah, I guess there's like a couple different things on this. Let me just get it in front of me. So we do have it in maintenance mode right now, but there was a request, and Dawson can chime in about this, for TSFN support for NAPI. We have an open pull request number 25002 for that. T. Neeson had also been making some requests for crypto-related features. And we also have the open pull request for namespaces, which may or may not get resolved. That one may not land. There's a bit of a backlog as well. So the request was doing another Semver miner while we are in maintenance. Does anyone have any concerns with that or anything they'd like to add?
No, if anybody has any questions on the TFSN, I can go into detail, but if there aren't any concerns, I won't.
Can you give like a really high level version of what it is and why it's important?
Yep. So basically, TFSN is thread safe functionality in NAPI, and one of the things that it does is it lets modules, it reduces the number of modules that would need to use libuv directly. And if you use libuv directly, you don't get the benefits of NAPI. So it's important, it's basically, an area we found that we had a gap in terms of adoption. And Gabriel did a lot of good work to put that together. It's been validated in that, FS events module. The maintainer used it and basically said, yeah, okay, this actually solves the problem. I don't need to use libuv anymore. And has said, it's important to them for this to actually be available across the LTS versions so that they can, release a new version that depends on that. They have a lot of users. Even some of their users are chiming in saying this would really, remove a lot of pain. So I think we have, a combination of factors that say, one, it's good for NAPI adoption, which we want to, promote. 2, we have actual users telling us that it's important that it gets in. And 3, I think it's, on the risk side, there's very little risk to anybody not using NAPI. And it's, it's additive versus, invasive changes or anything like that. So I think the risk is low as well. So the combination of those, for me, say that this is something we should include in a Semver miner.
So a couple questions on this really quickly. There's a bit of a pattern. It's not a bad thing, just like something that I'm noticing where like the value of an API really relies on things like this being consistent against, versions that are out in the wild.
Yep.
And so it seems to me like some of the policies and process that we have around LTS releases don't necessarily align 100% with the needs for NAPI related releases. And so I'm curious if perhaps we want to consider having some sort of cadence of NAPI updates during maintenance mode for specific release lines.
I think that makes sense to me in terms of, I'm hoping we don't have a stream of Semver miners. But it is important that things that, say bugs and stuff that we find are backported across the releases. So, just in that context, I think that would make sense.
Mm-hmm. Like even if it was just something like quarterly during maintenance, but it's like, I feel like I'm Mr. Grumpy showing up on every time there's something like this, having to say, hey, this is not in line with our process. And it's mostly because if we keep having one-offs, then it becomes really hard to say no to other things. But I think that might be something worth diving into as a policy change.
What's our once it goes into maintenance, what has been our typical sort of fix release frequency?
Up until now, there's been no frequency. Now, in theory, we could create like a quarterly frequency or something like that. And perhaps that may be actually better, is like we just say in maintenance, though, will be like a quarterly release of anything that's in the backlog. But essentially for maintenance right now, it's been, we don't do a release unless there are absolutely major breaking changes or there's major security vulnerabilities. We've been putting onto staging things that are like doc fixes or test fixes or like minor regressions with known fixes. But generally, we have not been doing releases of those. So I think like even right now, for example, if you were to go and check out 6.x staging, there's not a ton of commits, but there's like a JIP fix, a build fix, a tool fix, something fixing bootstrapping on BSD, some documentation fixes, some more build tests, and a test fix. These are really, really minor changes, but we have no release cadence or expectation to release it.
Right. And I guess, and does anybody have a concern that those won't make it in?
No, like that's the flip side is it doesn't seem like people are aggressively trying to get it for, I think like for most people who have needs for those specific fixes, at least having it on staging is something that they can cherry pick,
right,
which I think is the idea of like why we continue to land those things. But yeah, I think there was a concern partially around like availability, but also just around like the contract itself. And, you know, like when something's moving into maintenance, I don't think people are expecting it to really move around a lot.
No, but it's sort of like, so like in that context, I could certainly see that like the quarterly opportunity or something for an API would make sense, because it is important that the consistency is there, which may push things that, you know, you might not do otherwise. If it's a consistency thing, like I still want to minimize as much as possible what has to go back, right? Like just because we change, certainly just because something changes in an API doesn't mean it has to go back, unless, you know, the consistency side of things means that, you know, the different behavior will cause it not to work on one and to work on the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, making the, your suggestion of like saying, hey, once quarterly, there's the opportunity for things that are important to an API for a release to go out. That sounds like a good compromise to me.
Would someone like to take an action item of making a proposal for that?
I'm happy to write it up. Are there any, like, does anybody have any concerns that they'd want factored into that?
I don't really worry about it. For me, it's mainly just as soon as we really have something that we want to backport, I feel we should go for it. And if there's nothing, well, that's also fine. So I don't really think it's a big issue to do it either way.
And maybe I should write it up as we have this. I guess like it's kind of like the same thing as the security releases side of things, where we're talking about like try to have planned releases or what. Some things may come up where it's like, oh, this is just so important to backport, we should do it sooner than later. Other things, it's like, well, it's important that we do it, but it doesn't have to be done next week, right? So if there's a slot that's already planned in, that's maybe easier to manage in terms of, process and stuff, to just wait till then as opposed to doing it ad hoc. So I could write it up as like not an API specific, but that, we're planning in a potential slot for a release, and things that we believe are important and basically agreed as important by the release team would go into that particular candidate. Not necessarily everything. Like, I still think if people aren't pushing for things, we don't necessarily have to include them, right?
Yeah, so I have mixed feelings on this one. So with the security releases, which I don't know if we actually even have on the agenda right now, is it on today's agenda to talk about regular security releases?
No, it's not.
Yeah, I think that's actually in the discussions in the security repo, maybe.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's what our group is chartered for that. So like the security working group can definitely make suggestions to us about but that will like ultimately be our decision.
No, I agree. Yeah, I'm not.
No, and I realize, and I'm happy about that. I didn't. That wasn't meant as a grumpy, but like,
Yeah.
I have extreme reservations about doing regular security releases, especially when we're talking about LTS, when we have any sort of cadence, because we don't have that much cadence of releases to begin with. So
Sure.
ad hoc security releases make far more sense to me. The flip side of that, maintenance releases do not make sense to me to be ad hoc. And in fact, having ad hoc releases for maintenance makes me uncomfortable. I would much rather have an explicit contract. And even if it's only 2 commits or 3 commits, like we just push the release. I would rather us have a explicit contract of how, like for LTS, of how often people should expect releases, exactly when they should expect releases, and we should be adhering to that contract as much as possible. Security releases in general make way more sense to be like, when there's a vulnerability, let's get that patched and get that out there.
Right. The only thing is some of those don't need to go out. So for example, if we get 3 low priority vulnerabilities and we immediately patch each of those 3, you'll have to do 3 releases versus if you said, well, we've got one planned for 3 months from now. These don't warrant an immediate patch, so let's bundle them all into that one. So just in terms of the total work, you might end up with less work.
I'm definitely talking about like severe vulnerabilities when we're talking about immediately doing the releases. That's fine. I also like the idea that people were talking about that, like for certain low severity releases, perhaps we actually consider not even having as much of an embargo on them. But
yeah, that's a different way to go. So if that works out, or we think that's okay, then maybe that's an alternate. But the conversation was certainly around like immediate security one, like high severity ones. I think everybody was still agreed those need to go out immediately ad hoc.
Yeah,
it was just that if we, for the ones who aren't in that category, can we do something more planned? Like, let's give ourselves like you said, it's better to have it sort of structured and say, if it doesn't have to be ad hoc, let's have a plan for how we say we manage that and make the high severity ones an exception, or exceptional case, hopefully. And then the other ones, it's like, yeah, okay, at the end of the 3 months, you take all of them, you put them out, and that's saved you time. If they can be handled some other way, I guess I don't understand well enough how that would work or whatever. But if we can come up with something else that also means that those ones don't need their own releases, that's a good thing too.
So I guess we started with talking about 8. It seems like we're good with that.
Right. I just thought from the NAPI side, it'd be good to get the feedback from Gabriel, because there's the one that he has there, but there's another one to take it out of experimental, and based on not wanting to do too many releases, it sounds like we should get that one in there as well if we can. I know there's some complications on that front, but we should get Gabriel commenting on that side.
Do we want to set a date for that Node 6 release? Like a hard date so people know when they need to get the backports in by?
The other things, Miles, that you'd mentioned, are they far enough along that we know when that might make sense?
I think that I talked about maybe doing this release around the end of the quarter, like before 6 goes end of life. Was it more time sensitive for because I was just imagining like if we're trying to get this out there, it shouldn't be so time sensitive if people are also having to support 6 right now.
I don't see like the NAPI one. I don't think it needs to be this month or next month, or like it just, waiting till next December is probably too long, right?
Yeah, I was thinking end of March, early April, which is around the same time that we're talking about doing a Semver miner for 10.
Yeah.
And my biggest thing that I was hoping for is we have a TC39 meeting in 2 weeks where we'll maybe get a little more clarity to bring back about the namespace stuff, and hoping to have at least that conversation resolved and to see if it's even possible to get that in 8. And then aside from that, what there's the NAPI ones, and then I can follow up with T. Neeson about the crypto stuff. I just didn't start pinging people until we had consensus we were going to do the release.
Sure. I think end of March seems reasonable. Good time. Should we move on to the next section? I think we're pretty much in agreement that we will do another Semver minor. So,
yep.
The next one is changes to 10.x Q1 release schedule.
Yeah, so, Beth and Shelley, do either of you want to introduce that one?
So I can. So 10.15.1 is due to go out on the 29th. So I think that's a week later than we originally planned, just so that we can get a few more commits in there. And then from there onwards, February 12th will be 10.15.2, being released on the 26th of Feb. And then the Semver minor will be 10.16 now, and that will be on March 12th. So we've got that all in the issue 404 on the release repo. And I think we're maintaining a wiki as well with all of the correct dates on that. So any concerns or people happy with that cadence of releases?
That cadence sounds good to me.
And I believe that we have Shelley doing a release, and then Beth doing a release, and then I'm doing a release.
I believe so, yes.
I guess one of the things on this, timing-wise, and this overlaps with the next 11.x release, Shelley has not yet promoted a current release, so may not be able to promote the release that they have right now. So if I look at the current release schedule, there's one planned for the 22nd, which is next week, which is Targos. There was one planned for last week. Ruben, how many commits do you think are left on master compared to the staging branch right now? Is it a lot, or is it mostly nothing after you've done the backports?
We are actually in a very good state right now. So we were pretty bad in the meantime, but then well, Joey and me did a lot of backporting. Anna did a couple of things there. And now I think we have like 3 backport requests for 11. That's it.
Okay. I guess more direct, do you think that there'll be enough commits to do a release next week?
Oh, next week? Well, no, not really. I mean, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So Jordan asked about making a patch release, and I actually checked how difficult it is to do a patch release instead. And I have a branch which is 11.6.1 instead of 11.7.0 as I did initially. So we could do that instead. We could release a minor, a patch release right now instead of the minor one, and then do a minor one next week. Otherwise, I would wait longer.
How is it easy to rebase the Semver minor against that patch release, or does it introduce conflicts?
There was, I think, 1 or 2 conflicts in between that were easy to resolve. And what I did was I had the 11.7 already done, and then I just created a 11.6.1 by removing all the minors, and that was actually pretty straightforward.
So for context for people who don't know, when we landed NPM, I guess it's 6.5, it still had a RC tag inside of it, so it wasn't updated to the full stable release before we landed it. That's on me, sorry about that. But it went out in the release, and so the release does not have a standard version of NPM. So the request from Jordan, because he maintains NVM, was whether or not we could do a patch release to fix that. So the 11.6 line is, the tip of that line is not problematic. I had mixed feelings on it because we don't really have a support contract like that for current, and I don't necessarily want to start a habit of pushing off some of our minor releases to make patch releases because we don't really support those. The flip side of it, it seems to be good timing. Shelly, do you have time next week to do a release if it's mostly prepared and you just got to go through the promotion stages?
Sure, I can make that happen.
So I guess generally, if we have two options here, and one would be just doing the December minor release this week, and the other is doing a patch release this week and the minor next week. Does anybody have a preference?
I don't really mind either way. For me, it's more like we already have it here, so I don't think it's really bad to release the minor release right now.
Yep. I have a slight preference for just doing the minor release, although it seems convenient to allow Beth to promote the LTS to get that extra current release in. So I'm mixed on this. I'm indecisive and want someone to tell me what to do.
I'm pretty neutral, to be honest. I think either's fine, but I get what you're saying about not wanting to like set a precedent of we will always do this.
Any other opinions?
So I'd be willing to say we can do the patch this week and the minor next week so that Shelly can promote the LTS release. The alternative would be like, I guess like the other question too on this is like that rule about having to promote a current release before promoting a LTS release was something that was introduced as part of like a refactoring of the rules. I'm not even 100% sure if that had landed yet.
I don't think it's landed. I think it's in Rod's PR.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that we could say on this, you know, all things depending, because we don't have consensus on this and we haven't landed those updates to governance, it kind of feels like we're jumping through a lot of hoops for this onboarding.
Yeah.
Are people open to perhaps not having that rule of having to promote a current release before an LTS release? Because it seemed to have, for Beth as well, introduced a lot of friction and like unnecessary kind of politicking of who's doing the releases to make the onboarding work.
I agree.
I'm good with that because in the end, every release line is the same work.
Okay, so do we want to just do a minor release now, put a note in Rod's thing about not including that current release promotion rule, and Shelly can just promote the release in 2 weeks normally?
Sure.
Did Rod have any particular reasons for asking for that or rationale?
I think it was meant to be a smoke test so that like if there was anything wrong with your GPG key, if there was anything wrong with you promoting the release, if it blew a release, it blew a current release rather than an LTS release.
Yeah, I can see that rationale, but it's that we've and do we, you know, is this the first release somebody does on their own, or is it the first release they're doing at all?
I think it is the first. It is meant to be the first release where your GPG keys are signing the assets.
Right. Okay.
Now, with that being said, like we already have a rule where your key needs to be added 2 weeks before you even do a release.
Right.
So it's just kind of like another security gate. And I don't think it is for, you know, any problems that we've actually had. The problems that we've had before were a new releaser did a release like within a day or two, or the keys being added, so they hadn't really propagated.
Sure. I mean, I can see the rationale. It's like, yeah, you lower your risk for the first time. So I if there weren't any downsides, I'd say, hey, that's a great idea. But it sounds like it's actually caused, like on the ground, it causes us not to be able to get people to doing the LTS releases.
Yeah. Now the flip side of that, we could, and I think what's reasonable here, if we want, is perhaps as a group we decide not to obey the rule this time because it hasn't landed. See if there's any problems and then iterate. It's also very reasonable to assume that we're not going to be onboarding, like 3 or 4 releasers at the same time in the future.
Yes.
So this rule may make a lot more sense when we're not in the exact situation we're in today.
Yeah. So I could, yeah, like I think that's a good way to go in terms of saying, like, we think this rule is a good long-term rule. We're just kind of in a bind right now. And so, we'll make an
the rule
exception.
hasn't landed.
Right. And so,
and it's
exactly,
actively
like,
blocking stuff.
Yeah. So I think that's a good way to respond, to say, yeah, we think this is a good rule. It due to the situation we're in, we're not going to follow it this particular time because of this context. But going forward, yeah, it makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
That'd be my take. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not blocking or anything, just doing something else, but that seems reasonable to me.
I also think like the spirit of the rule isn't like so we start creating new releases so people can sign things. Although I do think like in reality that actually like if we want to have that safety check, that's the way for us to do it. And I think to like Beth, the point we were talking about from like a precedent standpoint, I think we can stand behind the precedent to say, no, we only did this release like from a security and reliability standpoint to like make sure that the keys were going out. But I think at this point, my gut on it is Shelley's keys have been propagated. They've been there for a little while. Those keys are working on GitHub already. I think it's fine to move forward with her signing the next release herself.
Yep.
Okay, I can take the action item to chime in on Rod's pull request about that. I think the request, that PR needs to be like rebased and updated as well. And it gave me permission last month to do so. So I'll go through and update that PR.
Okay, sounds good. I think we're happy with our 10.x plan. So the next is the 11.x plan. So we've got those. That's in a release issue 397. And we've kind of covered some of it, but obviously we've got the Semver minor going out. When do you think that will go out, Ruben?
Well, pretty much after the meeting, I would probably start propagating it.
Oh, sure. Perfect. And then there's one in the calendar for the 22nd of January, so that one will probably be pushed out, I guess, because that's only...
Yeah, that's likely. The main issue was just that there were so many conflicts. It didn't make a lot of sense anymore to backporting further things. And this is probably also the main issue about having like a static time schedule at the moment for release lines. If we hit too many conflicts, we should make sure to resolve all those conflicts before releasing a new version. Otherwise, it gets very difficult and to continue afterwards.
I think that this points at a bigger problem. It's a fun one because, when we started doing releases historically, when I started, we had the current release line and we had LTS, and they were treated as these like two very different things. And we developed a whole bunch of different process in LTS, and the current release line didn't adopt that process. The biggest one being using staging branches. And eventually we got to this point where LTS was kind of like on rails, like it was a lot of work, but it was like consistent. And the current releases were starting to get blocked. So there was an adoption of staging. And that actually made the releases for 11.x be able to go way faster. It allowed people to do work in between. And I think one of the things, and Ruben, we talked about this, I guess it was last year in Berlin, when a lot of the people who are now releasers were kind of first nominated to start doing this. And if anyone's listening, it gives you a good context of how long it takes to get onboarded for this stuff. But we were talking about how to solve these conflicts and how to manage backports. And I'm forgetting who initially came up with the idea. It was not myself, but the idea of not actually closing PRs until they have been backported or triaged. And I think the recent experience that happened on current there is good evidence that it's not only the LTS branches that are affected by this, they're just more likely to be affected by it. But I do really think that we should once again, as a project, be examining what the definition of done is, and potentially like reevaluate the process that we have of when we close PRs and make kind of backporting, labeling, and whatnot kind of part of the process. And potentially in that, even expanding the roles. So like right now, for example, the staging branches are locked to the release teams. But if we expanded that and made it so that anyone could land on any of the staging branches, we in theory could, be building the release out of that staging branch. And it would be a little bit more work for us from a staging perspective, but it would shift where the work is happening. So it might be better. I know Shelley has a lot of ideas about this as well.
Wow. So we spoke about it in Berlin, we spoke about it in Vancouver, and there were a couple of different ideas about it. I still personally think we need more automation here and not a big process change. So it was actually pretty straightforward to land the things after like 3 more difficult things landed that blocked the following commits, So it's mainly to push for a few specific backports and that they have to be done. Otherwise, we cannot release a new version. And
Yeah,
I mean,
I
it worked pretty well.
sorry. I agree with that, just in the sense that like building that into the expectation of a PR being done, I think the responsibility to some extent right now, I think lies very strongly on the backporters, and I think it would assist the overall process if it was more evenly distributed amongst those who are opening PRs.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying this is my view, but I know some of the comments that people have raised were like, especially if we get new collaborators and contributors raising PRs, they won't necessarily know what to do, and it may be a deterrent for people. If it's like, well,
but you could say the same thing about the labeling that we do, the way we land things. This is just like, people don't always land their own commits either, right? Like everyone chips in and helps move it forward.
Oh, I'm not arguing against the everyone. So maybe I was misinterpreting what you were saying, like in terms of saying it's the responsibility of the original PR opener to do the whole steps.
Not necessarily. In the same way, it's not the same responsibility of the PR opener to add the metadata and land it, right?
Yeah.
The responsibility of the project, and it's our definition of done. Okay,
yeah, no, that's totally different. So yeah, I don't think I've heard people object to that one.
So we mainly had issues actually about our own backports from our collaborators, and we should just try to encourage everyone to backport their things if we hit an issue. That's mainly the thing. I would not want to ask other people to backport their PRs all the time, because it's often already confusing for them in general, the process not merged, and they say, hey, why did you close the PR and so on, and then when we say, okay, would we land it and why is it still open? So these things are confusing for people not knowing the process as closely as we do.
I think that's fine. Like, I'm not trying to be unempathetic about it, but it's like, if we clearly communicate to people, I think that that's fine. Having done this for like going on, it's almost 4 years now, the fact that the PRs are closed, that they're read, that we need to use metadata to grep and find the ones that need to land is a source of a ton of extra work. And the fact that PRs close, especially when collaborators are done with them, and there's no intention for people to chip in and help on that, essentially means that people walk away from the things that they work on. They forget the context of them. And by the time we get to them, they don't necessarily have the time or motivation to help get it over so it can even get into a release. And that ends up with situations that we're talking about where like we're blocked on even doing a current release. So I don't know what the answer is, but I don't think that what we have is sufficient.
Yeah, I even think there's some, I don't know, even special cases like some big refactors. You wonder if there couldn't be a higher expectation for help on that as well, because some of those cause a lot of churn, right, and require the context. So somebody else doing that is can be quite difficult.
There was one more thing that I thought about, and I would like to more often backport major commits, because we could just have a follow-up commit often that actually makes the Zemver major thing to either Zemver minor or Zemver patch. Now, often the actual breaking change is a tiny code change. And we would reduce our churn by actually backporting Zemver, at least some Zemver major commits.
Can you expand a little bit more on like the exact process that you're imagining for that?
So right now, for example, in the current proposal that I have, there are two commits marked as Zemver major. One was from Joey, and she backported it in a way and that she took the commit as it is, and then just had a follow-up commit where she, in this case, it was setting the prototype of console to something as it was before, instead of how it was originally done in her commit. And it was just a one-line change afterwards as extra commit. We could also sometimes have like in the original PR, we could already say, okay, let's do a version check. And if it is in this version, well, do A. And if it is in a different version, do B. That could have been done in her PR, for example. That way we wouldn't have had to do anything in that PR, but backporting it straightforward. And a lot of PRs were relying on her change there because there was a lot of different changes as well in that commit. So I would like to try to introduce something like that, because it would just reduce the total amount of churn while backporting PRs.
So it sounds to me that this is something that would be like part of the review process and just kind of like an ideology when separating code and thinking about those patches.
Pretty much, yes.
Cool.
To ask, okay, let's do it a version check or something like that, and then we can just mark it as we backport this, even though it is Zemver major.
That sounds good to me. Do you think that we'd need like a playbook or some sort of documentation on how to do it?
I believe we should document it, yes. And I would also be willing to try to write something up about it.
But backporting to which stream? Sorry.
It doesn't matter in this case. And like whatever release line you would want to have, we could say, okay, this is with this change, it would either be a patch change or a minor, and then we could just pull those in as well.
Okay, so basically not, yeah, I was just thinking about the Semver minor part, but it's like, okay, we would modify it so it wouldn't be Semver minor and get most of the change back.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Should we start writing some of these proposals down in issues in the release wiki? I know there was a few of them that we've mentioned today, so any ideas to make it smoother, we should just start writing down so people can start weighing in and commenting on them.
Yeah, opening issues around these seem like a good place to start to get conversation going and discuss action items and move things forward.
Sure. The last thing on the agenda was bring back regular release meetings. So I know this time doesn't work for Rod, but does it work? Well, it works for you guys here. Will it work ongoing the next 2 weeks?
Works for me.
This
For me
time,
as well.
yeah, this time works for me. I'm the next meeting will be during the TC39 meeting, so I may miss that, and then the following, I don't know. My schedule is a mess with travel and stuff, so I won't be able to make every meeting. But from a general schedule time, it's available for me. And for what it's worth, kind of as a follow-up to that, I added it as a biweekly right now into the calendar for this time. We have it set up in the Zoom for a scheduled conference call at this time. And then all the details for the Zoom are in there. So other than just saying, hey, we're moving forward with this time, I don't think that there's any action items right now. One thing we may want to consider doing is maybe, once every couple meetings, shifting it by a couple hours so Rod could join might be a nice thing to do.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can ask Rod for a day and time that is convenient for him, and we can reschedule one of the meetings so that he can participate.
Yep. Okay.
And I'd suggest somebody update the templates to include the webinar link, just to make everybody's life easier.
I can do that. I can take an action to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're good. Anything else people want to discuss today?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think is worth bringing up again, I had, kind of said that I would be stepping down from releases a couple months back. And I think that after doing the Semver minor for 10 at the end of March, it might be time for me to move to Emeritus on release. Do people feel comfortable with that? I wouldn't be stepping down from helping with backports. I just, would not be actively releasing stuff anymore. Are people concerned about that from an availability standpoint? Do we think we have enough releasers right now to keep things running? Is that a no?
I think looking at the schedule where it's like, or at least 10 is hopping between me and Shelley, it looks manageable for now. We might want to look at onboarding another person, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I have 3 releasers, then it's 1 release per person per quarter, which is like super manageable. With that being said, perhaps we can make a concerted effort to try to onboard more people. I think this is one thing to consider as well. So like right now for current, we have, like Ruben and Targos who have been, actively doing it. I know that Joyi had expressed interest as well. So we definitely can get Joyi onboarded for the current release stream, and maybe look into finding one other person to help out with LTS. And so, yeah, maybe we can do that. I guess, how do people think about identifying people? Do you think it's something where we should be going and recruiting, or should we be doing an open thing where people can submit? Shelley and Beth, I'd be very interested, and Ruben, your perspectives on this as people who are just onboarded and have an idea of like how much context and work you need to do to be ready to start releasing. Like, how do you think we should go about doing that?
I think certainly for me, having raised a couple of backport PRs myself with Gibson's help when I first started looking at Node, that's definitely something we should look for and maybe help people to do. So, and not just bring them straight in, start with a few commits into Node and then raise some backport PRs and then go into the releasing.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
I guess
I definitely also agree that sort of spreading out and emphasizing the fact that those types of backport PRs have a lot of value. And just sort of seeing if we can increase the discoverability of like, hey, if you would like to help out with Node and not necessarily just like open PRs to master, then like this is another great way you can contribute potentially. I think sort of emphasizing those things is another great way potentially to see who may be interested in doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I agree, Shelley. I know one of my colleagues, actually, they just got their first couple of PRs into Node and they were like, what do I do next? And actually one of the slightly easier things, if they're not confident enough to add a new feature or something like that, backporting someone else's change that's maybe stalled while waiting for a backport PR is actually quite a nice way for them to, still contribute to the project without actually having to work out how to add a new feature.
Yeah, that definitely sounds good.
Maybe it's something we could add to, code and learn as well. You've got the option of like easy, intermediate tasks. Maybe there's one for people that maybe want their first backport or something.
Yeah, like that sounds really interesting. Like we almost could do like a smaller code and learn just around backporting, which is, or like have the backports as a good second commit, right? Yeah. Because you're getting into like kind of deeper stuff and more complex stuff, but at the very least, you don't have to write the patches yourself, which is kind of like a nice compromise.
Yep. Sure. I can open an issue to talk about how we can encourage people to backport PRs.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. As a heads up, I know that there is a meeting scheduled right after this one.
Okay.
But so we're gonna get kicked in 2 minutes, so we may want to wrap up.
Yep, I think we're good. We've gone through everything in the agenda. Next meeting in 2 weeks at the same time, and I'll upload the minutes. They're just locally for now, so I'll upload them to the doc in a bit. I think we're good.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.